Have you ever Googled your own name? Prepare for a shock because your personal info, including addresses and phone numbers, is all out there. It's all harvested by data brokers and sold legally. Aura is a personal digital security service that scans the internet for your sensitive information and provides a full suite of privacy-enhancing tools. For a limited time, Aura is offering listeners a 14-day free trial at aura.com/safety. That's AURA.com/safety to learn more and activate the 14-day trial period.
Stocks for beginners. Phil Muscatello and Finpods are authorised reps of Money Sherpa. The information in this podcast is general in nature and doesn't take into account your personal situation.
Really what I always tell most people is, just buy a couple index funds. You should be looking at the S&P 500. And who wouldn't want to own a fraction of America's 500 greatest businesses? There's a lot of things that America does well and a lot of things it does poorly, but we do capitalism pretty well.
Hi, and welcome back to Stocks for Beginners. I'm Phil Muscatello. What's the world's largest stock investing podcast? It's not this one, but a boy from the suburbs of Sydney can only dream. Joining me today is Shawn O'Malley, the chief editor and financial writer for the Investors Podcast Network's We Study Markets newsletter, which of course is an offshoot of the We Study Billionaires podcast. How are you, Shawn?
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
No, thanks for coming on. And I just kind of wished we recorded our conversation yesterday because it was almost like what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, I think we started diving into things and we realized that we should be hit and record. But, I guess that's just, it's fun to just shoot from the hip sometimes and you never know where the conversation's going to go. So hopefully we have some fun today.
Hopefully fun. So tell me about starting investing when you were about 10 or 11 years old. That's not a very common, well, actually, it is common. I found so many people that I interview on this podcast do actually have this kind of experience. But how did that work for you? What were your first stocks?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I got really the itch for stock investing from my uncle. He was a banker and he would always be watching CNBC whenever we'd visit him. He always had it on the background. And I think specifically he had on the show Mad Money. He would watch Jim Cramer. And that's where,
that was a while ago.
Yeah, it was a while ago. Yeah. And so, I found it so fascinating, this world of, if you could be savvy about managing your own money, really the world is your oyster. And it felt like so many people work for money. And this idea that, having your money work for you is like such a profound idea to a 12 or 13-year-old or however old I was. And so, I actually just would have these kind of weekly conversations with him talking about stock investing and trying to keep up, what he was doing. And I honestly probably mirrored a lot of his early stock investments. He would say, as a banker, he would say, Bank of America is looking cheap. Or, he would give me a lot of bank stocks, which are not the, sexiest picks for a teenage boy. But I think that's where I got my start. And then I remember, tracking it for a few years, and then Fitbit had its IPO. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, an IPO, it's a, brand new stock. And I somehow thought I was going to have this early investing advantage of, surely all of Wall Street isn't, following this IPO. And, by watching Jim Cramer's Mad Money, I have the inside scoop. And so, I don't keep up with Jim Cramer as much anymore, but I really did watch his show every single night, probably through most of middle school and for the first couple of years of high school. And I recognize that was not a common experience for your average, 8th grader. And I read his books, and he was really kind of my gateway drug to the world of finance and investing. So, to much as he is sometimes maybe mocked today, I really do owe him a debt for being the person who taught me a lot of the really basic concepts of how the stock market works and what even it means to own a stock.
It's really good to have someone like your uncle explaining these things for you, because so many people have their first experience with the stock market going, oh, I've heard about this company. There's a great story there. Like you say, no one else on Wall Street's heard of this story. I'm going to buy this stock. And of course, you can often end up as the patsy.
Yeah, I mean, it was a privilege to have, a trusted family member be sort of looking out for me a little bit to make sure I didn't do anything, too stupid or too reckless or even to sort of manipulate me. And it's not lost to me that that's a privilege, and financial literacy is not as common as it should be. And, my hope is to kind of be mentor is maybe too strong of a word, but I hope to be a similar...
Someone's gateway drug.
Yeah, someone's gateway drug to getting into finance and investing. And my hope is that for most people, when they go and sign into their to set up their 401k for the first time, when they get their first job out of college, that they're not saying, what is an S&P 500 index fund? If we can at least cover the basics of what an S&P 500 index fund is, you're actually at a good place. You're probably ahead of the vast majority of people. And if you're confident enough to be doing stock picking, maybe you're dumb and naive, or maybe you're really sophisticated. But I think everybody has their own journey of what brings them into finance and investing, and that you're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's just part of the process. But the more trusted voices you can have in your life, even people like Jim Cramer or people like my uncle, or hopefully even what I try to do in my newsletter or your podcast, have people that are trying to look out for you and just give you their honest advice and giving you that room to make your own mistakes and learn from your errors. But also, when you're ready to learn after you make those mistakes, having somebody who can give you that sort of trusted advice.
It's interesting that you talk about an index fund and just even knowing the basics of that as being a perfect introduction into the stock market. And it is really, isn't it? Because you're learning about, well, first of all, what an index is and what S&P 500 actually stands for example. And then you can start looking into it and see, I mean, I know a lot of tools now give you a kind of look through into what it is constituted of. And that's such valuable learning experience, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. If you can explain simply what an S&P 500 index fund is, you're in a good place. I think that's a good general barometer of financial health. And yeah, so many people want to ask me about their stock picks. And yeah, you go out to a bar with friends and somebody's saying, okay, should I be investing in Peloton right now? Honestly, people expect me to have some sort of, insider knowledge of it. This is the stock you should be buying today. And, really what I always tell most people is, just buy a couple index funds. You should be looking at the S&P 500. And who wouldn't want to own a fraction of America's 500 greatest businesses? There's a lot of things that America does well and a lot of things it does poorly, but we do capitalism pretty well. We've got some pretty great companies that know how to make money. And setting everything aside, as an investor, that is exactly the kind of places you want to have your money invested in, the companies that are among the best in the world at generating profits. So, the S&P 500 is a sort of curated index that's, updated quarterly, and you see some big changes every few years to reflect America's largest companies. So in many ways, you could do a whole lot worse than just owning the 500 biggest and most profitable companies in the United States. And I certainly encourage people to diversify internationally. But like I said, that's a pretty good starting place.
And it's interesting being approached by friends in a bar that have a story to tell you. Often I'll get friends in bars saying to me, oh, what about lithium? Every EV is going to be requiring lithium. What about this company? Have you heard about this company? And of course, I've never heard of the company. And my first response to them is always, is this company making money?
Yeah. And I think that is a concept that is very foreign to a lot of people. And they say, no, it doesn't matter if it's making money. It's about whether the price is going to go up, and I'm going to buy it today and sell it to somebody at a higher price tomorrow. And, the kind of financial jargon term for that is the greater fool theory, right? Of, you pay a price and then you find some other fool to pay a higher price. And there's no bounded economic reality underpinning sort of what you're doing. And, there's plenty of financial academic literature to back up this kind of very simple statement that I'll say that, a company's share price over the long term is driven by its earnings, and its earnings is a jargony word for its profitability. And so, like I said, whether you're investing in the S&P 500 or you're picking, individual companies, starting from a place of looking at what is just profitable is a surprisingly simple insight that's really all too commonly overlooked. Yeah, it's really shocking. Like you said, somebody will be pitching a mining company or a new tech startup, and it's, they're pre-revenue, but they have this huge market opportunity. And it's like a pre-revenue. I could set up a lemonade stand and be post-revenue. You're investing in something that's pre-revenue. That's really seems incredibly early.
Shawn, we've jumped straight in. Usually I go, okay, well, what's your origin story? But we've jumped right into investing. So let's go back to your origin story. What kind of jobs were you doing before? You studied finance at college and then moved into the finance industry and started making rich people even richer? Is that the basis of it?
Yeah, that's that was the line I told myself for why I needed to get out of my job. But yeah, I had a very basic finance degree, was very interested in stock investing and thought that I was on track to be a Wall Street all-star. And, I was doing the CFA, which is the, Chartered Financial Analyst exam. And that's 300 hours of studying, and I passed the level 1. And speaking of the S&P 500, funny enough, I worked at a company called S&P Global, which one of the things they do is produce the S&P 500 stock index. I was basically the guy who bailed out investment bankers, not to overstate the complexity of the work that I was doing, but S&P has this data platform similar to a Bloomberg terminal. They call it CapIQ or CapIQ Pro are the two versions of the platform. And so basically I was, spent months learning to be a trained specialist and navigating their platform. And then I would go on and I would work with investment bankers trying to pull transaction comps on certain, mergers and acquisitions or trying to value companies. And, I would learn how to quickly go into their spreadsheets and figure out, okay, this is the error with your formula. This is why the data is not pulling. This is how you should restructure it. So I learned a lot about the actual kind of financial modeling aspect that you might do in investment banking, but also just sort of the technical nuances of this data platform that we were working on. And, it was fun and exciting at first to feel like, wow, I'm wasn't really working on Wall Street, but sort of Wall Street adjacent. And I had this very clear trajectory to probably making lots of money over the next couple of years. And it was a very standard path to go down. But as you said, it felt like, wow, who am I helping? Well, I'm helping investment bankers. I'm actually getting paid a lot less than they are to in many ways do their job. And who are investment bankers helping? And, I'm not an anti-Wall Street guy. I understand the purpose that the financial system serves. But at the same time, you realize you're enriching a lot of people at a lot of big banks and big companies and already wealthy people. And you're not really taking, even at a minimum, you're not sharing what you've learned and certainly not helping the average Joe. I mean, a subscription to the CapIQ data platform that I worked on with these investment bankers is some, $30,000 a year per person. The average person is not paying $30,000 a year. So you're already just from the beginning in this very walled off, exclusionary world of you're only working with people who can afford a $30,000 membership fee. So it's almost like a country club of financial data. You're working with hedge funds and big investment banks that would buy 100 or 200 subscriptions at a time, and they would plug different teams into it. But there's certainly this kind of disturbing feeling that, am I going to look back on my career one day and ask myself, who did I help and what value did I create for the world? And maybe I'll say, I did a hell of a job doing a discounted cash flow on Apple stock that some banking team at JP Morgan is looking at or whatever. But what does that get you? Really that doesn't create a lot of value for society, or at least for me, it didn't feel like it was something I would be very proud of looking back on.
Ready to pop the question? The jewelers at BlueNile.com have got sparkle down to a science with beautiful lab-grown diamonds worthy of your most brilliant moments. Their lab-grown diamonds are independently graded and guaranteed identical to natural diamonds. And they're ready to ship to your door. Go to BlueNile.com and use promo code LISTEN to get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. That's code LISTEN at BlueNile.com for $50 off. BlueNile.com, code LISTEN.
Are you looking for unbiased, in-depth market insights? Deep Knowledge Investing is dedicated to providing conflict-free, well-researched stock ideas. Gary Brode is a 30-year Wall Street hedge fund veteran turned to the good side. He's dedicated to providing you with independent and timely market commentary. Deep Knowledge Investing is supported by a large, successful and highly engaged board of advisors who provide expert advice and insights in a variety of fields and industries. Gary appears regularly on this podcast, so you can check out his insights for yourself and see if he's the right guy for you. Receive 50% off a Deep Knowledge Investing subscription by using the promo code STOCKSFORBEGINNERS50, that's 50. By using this promo code, you can subscribe for 6 months for only $100 or check it out for a month for only $25. That's deepknowledgeinvesting.com and use the promo code STOCKSFORBEGINNERS50. By using this code, you'll be helping to support this podcast. Deep Knowledge Investing, helping you to beat the market. Tell us about getting in with the fast crowd at the Investors Podcast Network. I believe it was during COVID.
Yeah, no, it's, thank you for asking. It was a funny story where I found myself in the the world of COVID lockdowns, and I'm looking around wondering, okay, how long is this going to last for? How am I going to spend my time? And when it quickly became pretty apparent that this may be an enduring weeks or months long phenomenon, I decided, okay, I'm going to use my time at least somewhat productively. It's very tempting to just be lazy and relax around the house and tell yourself, kind of white lies about why it's okay to not do anything productive. But I told myself, I'm going to go for a couple walks a day. I'm going to listen to some educational podcasts. So I started out on a walk with my dog, and I searched just investing on Spotify. And the Investors Podcast Network, which is the name of the company I now work for, popped up. And then our flagship show, We Study Billionaires, I started listening to it, and I fell in love. I loved it. I felt like I had a rekindled love for like value investing all over again in many ways, especially, doing the CFA and learning to think Wall Street. And, they're not talking about Warren Buffett and, true intrinsic value of companies and long-term ownership. A lot of it's very short-term minded, and, it's a very different way of thinking about investing. And so I fell in love with the We Study Billionaires podcast, and I listened, every week for at least, 2 years. And then you flash forward to 2022, and I see an advertisement for a YouTube host position of all jobs with the Investors Podcast. And I thought, I don't know anything about YouTube. I don't think I have the personality to be on YouTube. I don't think I have the face to be on YouTube. I don't, all of the insecurities, all the, whatever. And, I said, I got to get in with this company. I mean, this is my dream. I've been, listening to these shows for so long. I saw it almost in many ways as a ticket out of the kind of trap of working a 9 to 5 for the rest of my life. So I threw a Hail Mary, and I sat down and, I wrote a lengthy email applying for the job and filmed these videos that were, in hindsight, were horrible, were laughably bad, of me trying to pitch myself as a YouTube host. And so, I meet with our company's co-founder, Stig Brodersen, and, he's not impressed with me at all. We'd go 20 minutes into the interview. He tells me I'm too Wall Street, I'm too formal, I'm too corporate, I take myself too seriously. And I just said, I got to hit the reset button. I'm starstruck, speaking to the person who has, really changed how I see the world of finance and investing. I mean, we had a heart-to-heart conversation after that. And, I guess he was willing to give me a second chance. And he kind of said, I'd like to keep in touch, and I'll hear from you, again down the road. And I thought it was a very polite way of telling me off. And I was thinking, I really wasted my opportunity here, my chance to break out of the corporate life and work my dream job in many ways. And, funny enough, he followed up and he goes, hey, I'm not going to hire you as a YouTube host, but, we have this stock investing guide that we need somebody to write. I'll let you do that. Take a crack at it. I did. I guess I did well enough that he then said, hey, we have this email list and we're looking to build a daily investing and financial markets newsletter. I'd like you to be the person to bootstrap it. So I joined in 2022, and I've spent the last year, doing just that, bootstrapping the newsletter. And now I work with a wonderful team of writers, and, we're very proud of the work we do. And, ultimately it boils down to just trying to teach as many, non-financial professionals about how the financial system works and how it impacts them, and why a lot of this very esoteric Wall Street stuff may actually, matter to them.
And it's so great that we're living in this era now where so much information is available from podcasts, from newsletters like yourself, and that investors actually can get the very basic knowledge that they need to start investing. And it's like we were saying before, you don't need to, there's certain kinds of people. If you're going to be investing in individual stocks, you've got to do a lot of work and a lot of research. But even understanding where your 401k is being invested, or what an ETF is, so that an index ETF, for example, or even being able to watch out for what may be common mistakes. Are there any mistakes that you've seen people making, or have you had any contact with people via the network that have shared their mistakes and
oh man,
and how they could have done things a little better?
Oh boy, so many mistakes.
There's
I think
a plethora of mistakes.
I'm sure I could come up with some specific ones, but I really think just the general phenomenon of what we've seen in markets the last couple of years, with especially this bubble in 2021, I feel like that really hit me at an informative age. When I watched these people around me, especially kind of being, everybody, I was the guy that, I was their one stock investing friend, or, finance nerd. And, people would come up to me and they're day trading options. And I'm thinking, what do? You work in insurance? What? You sell cars? Why are you day trading, Tesla options, and it was some sort of almost, it's funny because I'm sitting here telling people how I want to teach them about investing in finance and managing their money well, and, ethical ways to do this stuff and being disciplined. And you would think on the one hand, I would be so excited to see more people engaging with investing and even trading. But no, I mean, it was actually very disturbing because I see people and I realize, I barely know what I'm doing with options. I understand the basics, but I know enough to know that I shouldn't be messing around with them more than on sort of an experimental basis. And I see friends that are putting, huge chunks of their net worth into options that expire in 2 weeks. And, that was actually, it was very disturbing to me to know so many people who were kind of being very reckless with their money. And it was this bubble psychology. And, I actually did some things that I regret that were, semi-reckless with my own investments. Even though I should have known better, I felt the pressure. I knew a friend who made like $5,000 on Dogecoin. And I'm sitting there thinking like, I know better than to invest in Dogecoin, but what other crypto projects maybe should I throw a couple $100 at? Or maybe I should be, buying Tesla options. And what is this crowd phenomenon that everybody seems to know that I am missing out on it? And I actually worried that I had some financial hubris where I thought I was, too good to take advantage of some of these opportunities that were low-hanging fruit to make money. So it was a really interesting experience to live through, to realize that even despite everything I've learned and many, the great investors that I've studied, I'm just as fallible as everybody else. And I didn't make any critical mistakes, but just feeling that side of me come out where I could capitulate to the kind of groupthink of, maybe I should buy some Tesla stock, or, maybe I should pile into XYZ trending and investment of the day. And I mean, it was a nationwide phenomenon, GameStop. I was in I would go in the Wall Street Bets forum, and, not because I was seriously following it, but it was just such a fascinating kind of real-time case study to see these people and talk about good stories of mistakes that people made. I mean, every day I would go in there and it was somebody made $1 million and somebody lost their entire life savings. And, one story really popped out to me where, a fellow had said that they took all of their student loans and they took all that money, and rather than using it to pay for tuition, they poured it into like Tesla options and they lost it all. And they're sitting there saying, how do I pay for school this semester? How do I get more student loans? And they were going to try to take the next round of student loans and take that money and then try to win back. And, it's just, it was kind of a gross phenomenon, really, in many ways. A lot of people, despite the markets generally rising so much over that period, there were a lot of individual investors that tried to go all in and they just got burned.
I interviewed Spencer Jacob, who's an editor at the Wall Street Journal, who wrote a book on that particular subject. I can't recall the name straight off. Sorry, Spencer. But what he was saying is that in the end, Wall Street still won because they make money clipping the ticket. So they didn't really care, whereas all of these Redditors and Bored Apes were thinking, we're getting one up on Wall Street. We're, sticking it to the man. But in the end, it was just increasing the amount of trading and increasing the amount of money that was flowing through the conduits of Wall Street.
That's exactly right. Yeah, the amount of times I would go into Wall Street Bets and read about how they were going to stick it to some hedge fund. And the reality was, like you said, they were just, feeding market makers and these sort of intermediaries who are market neutral, and they just benefit from, increases in trading volume. And so, yeah, I think one or two hedge funds blew up, but it was kind of a shark feeding frenzy for 99% of the rest of the space. So yeah, there was a cruel irony to it. And there was this very romantic story, especially going around Wall Street Bets, where a lot of these folks were saying, I lost everything in the 2008 financial crisis and I'm going to stick it to Wall Street. And fortunately, that's just not how it works. Even if they would target these companies that were very heavily shorted. And yeah, sure, maybe if you could somehow pull off a short squeeze like you did with GameStop, maybe you can blow up one hedge fund. But, there's a dozen others that are going to be market neutral, and they're going to, just be printing money because of all the increased trading volume. And, it's a very crude way to try to take on Wall Street, but like I said, it was romantic and it was very noble to read these people telling these stories about how they lost it all in 2008. And this is their chance to stick it to the man. And I would ask, what man are you sticking it to, and what does this accomplish? And, people would have no problem wiping out their life savings just as to kind of perpetuate this narrative. And like I said, it was a disturbing thing to watch, especially, kind of knowing enough to know what was really happening. And God forbid you try to speak up in the Wall Street Bets forum, you're going to get shut down. It was like, so you just kind of had to watch this, slow moving accident happen in many ways.
Let's get back to the safe world of value investing. I've got a bad taste in my mouth after thinking about all of that. So you consider yourself to be a value investor, but how has your experience being involved with the podcast network changed your view of value investing?
It's a great question. And in many ways, I think that, a naiver version of myself would have told you the only real way to make money in stock investing is to be a value investor. And honestly, in the time sense, what our podcast company does every week is we interview, many of the best investors from around the world. And a lot of them are not, pure value investors. They have very different ways of making money in financial markets. A lot of people don't trade with anything to do with equities, right? People trade commodities and people trade volatility, and there's all different types of trading strategies. So I think as I've learned about more different ways to make money in financial markets, as even a day trader, which is kind of a dirty word, but there are, actually legitimate ways to sort of do that. Or as this kind of romantic, long-term value investor, there's a lot of ways to make money. And so I try to be a lot less judgmental, I think, of other investment approaches. And when something's working, I'm really curious to try to figure out what exactly are the factors driving this success and how much is this attributable to randomness and luck. But, there are these very real psychological phenomenon that drive asymmetries in markets. And, for example, momentum trading. There were plenty of people that rode the momentum wave of this bubble I'm talking about in 2021, 2020, 2021. And if you know how and when to get out, a lot of people made money doing that. And that's not my risk profile. That's a game I don't know how to play. And my skill set is personally better suited for the kind of value investing ideology for investing. But, really the biggest takeaway for me is not necessarily about value investing specifically, but just being humble and honest about the fact that there's a lot of different ways to make money in markets. And who am I to cast judgment? It's very easy to say, oh, I'm a value investor and better than other types of stock investors and traders and people in other financial markets. And it's just not the reality. If you know how to reliably do what you do to make money in markets, that's valid.
Because a lot of people start taking on some of the nostrums of Buffett and Munger, and they start spouting the quotes, and they think, yes, well, I'm a value investor because now I've used these quaint little sayings that I've heard. But I think you've sort of also seen, and especially with We Study Billionaires, because the guys are talking to a whole bunch of people who've made money. And it's like you say, there's all sorts of ways of making money in the markets. And just speak to that for a moment.
Yeah. Well, there's a certain snootiness to value investing, like you said, where you quote these sort of very colloquial things that Buffett would say. And don't get me wrong, I have as much respect for Buffett as, anyone in the world. I went and saw him in Omaha speak with Charlie Munger this year, and it was one of the highlights of my professional career. But at the same time, it does bother me when I see people just kind of throw out these very generic expressions that Buffett may use or maybe even misinterpret the context with which he said it. One interesting thing about Buffett is that the investment that he's made the most money on in his career from a kind of a nominal total amount of dollars perspective is from Apple. And that's a company that many for years would have called a tech company, and he would have, avoided investing in entirely. And so in many ways, he is far more flexible and dynamic of an investor than a lot of people give him credit for. People say he would never invest in tech, and maybe Apple isn't a tech company, but I don't know, they produce a lot of great technology. So Buffett himself has learned and evolved over time. And I'm not telling anyone to go dive into tech stocks that they don't understand, but we do live in a different world. And a lot of, where Buffett started out with was inspired by his mentor, Benjamin Graham, who would do, the expression is cigar butt investing, where you would pick up these stocks on the side of the road that had one puff left, and you'd get the last puff out of them. And they'd be, often companies in dying industries and manufacturing, or maybe even literally the tobacco industry, some dying industry like that. And, they would still have a couple more years of profitability before the industry entirely slipped out underneath them. And you'd buy up those companies and throw off a ton of free cash flows for a couple of years, and you might be able to get some sort of mean reversion, and you make a few bucks on it. But his start wasn't the sort of long-term own great high quality companies for many years that people sort of associate with him now. And so he's had multiple of these inflection points in his career. And I would challenge a lot of the people today who maybe blindly is a harsh word, but sort of blindly follow the teachings of Benjamin Graham and Warren Buffett to consider being as flexible in a rapidly changing world. Adam Cecil, I believe, wrote a book called Value Investing 3.0. And, the very premise of the book is that value investing needs to be updated for the modern world. And when you look at how accounting system works and how companies are valued, a lot of the time that, they'll have these very valuable intangible assets. They'll have all this software and code that they've built up over the years because some of the nuances of the accounting system, rather than being lasting assets on those companies' balance sheets, those are actually expensed. And so, many of these great companies like Google and Facebook and Apple for a long time looked really expensive on paper because, rather than these investments that they're making in R&D being capitalized on their balance sheet in the same way that a manufacturing company who invests in a warehouse or whatever, the way that might be reflected on its balance sheet over 20 years, a lot of these investments in software were being expensed immediately. It was basically like, it was lost value altogether. So even just there's some failures of the modern accounting system to really capture what companies are worth in the 21st century and how to value this very, digitally native economy that we find ourselves increasingly moving into. So he's been a great influence on me, and I've really enjoyed reading his book. And I think he is probably touching on a very important inflection point. And, again, like I said, I would just encourage a lot of people to be honest about what they don't know and humble about it and, be willing to be flexible, to think about how the world is changing around them and, whether extrapolating lessons from the 1940s with Benjamin Graham are still appropriate. And again, there's some incredible fundamental truths that I wouldn't want to disregard or have people overlook. But on the other hand, there's just some technical aspects of markets that are very different now.
It is interesting to dwell upon the fact that you've got to actually give yourself a reason not to buy a company. I think it's too easy to look at the good side of a company, look at the story and say, oh, this is a great story, this one's for me. But just to understand how much time Warren Buffett spends reading annual reports. And I just wanted to also say something else that I've been looking at is free cash flow and trying to understand free cash flow a lot more because, as you say, companies have changed. And do you believe then that free cash flow does give you a more accurate view of how well a company can go in the future, even if it is putting a lot of money into capital expenditure to grow for the future?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, free cash flows are the sort of oxygen of a business, the money that is really coming in the door for a company to operate successfully. Kind of what I was talking about before, where you can get these accounting manipulations with how companies' assets are capitalized and whether certain things are expensed or not. Net income is very much an accountant's number. It's manipulated in many ways. And then that was, something I spent a lot of time studying in the CFA exams, is learning all the different ways you can manipulate net income. As a corporate CFO, you can manipulate net income in your favor on a quarterly basis. And it's a very short-term thing to do. And you can put off making certain investments and drain down your inventory stocks and do stuff like that, where, you can say, oh yeah, look, our net income is higher today and you're growing, profits at 4% every quarter, whatever it is. But in reality, you're kind of creating a paper tiger. That is something that's not durable and lasting. And so free cash flows are really the foundation of any company. And if you have positive free cash flows, you can continue operating. And it's certainly one of the first things I look for. And of course, look at net income. But at the end of the day, my eyes are going to look at free cash flows.
So many companies these days are software as a service organizations. And of course, they can have a lot of money coming through the door, but the cost of acquiring new customers means that the profit can be impaired for many, many years. So is this a way that you use to look at a company like that would be beyond what you would say is a traditional value investing metric?
Yeah, I mean, software companies are tough. I won't pretend that I'm an expert in software tech investing. I probably read that book on Adam Cecil, and I found it very interesting, and more from or less from a vantage point of thinking, wow, I know so much about how tech companies work that I'm going to be able to invest in them profitably. But again, to kind of this point that we were talking about earlier, there's so many different ways to make money investing. Even just within the niche of value investing, there's very different schools of thought of how to make money. which is really interesting to me. The more I learn about the software business, I can see why a lot of these companies are worth the extreme valuations that they are, because they have such low operating costs. And there's no frictional cost to selling another unit of Microsoft, right? You sell another unit of paper, you've got to pay to produce that paper. And maybe you're spreading out your fixed costs and getting some economies of scale, but there's still those variable costs. Whereas with the digital world and software as a service programs, there's really no variable cost, maybe a little bit of computing power and electricity power on the margins, but it's so extremely negligible that these companies can scale in a way that was, literally unprecedented a few decades ago. And that's why, we saw the dot-com era boom in the 1990s. And, it's not that investors were wrong. They were just early. Wall Street was really excited about these incredible margins of profitability and ability to scale that companies could have. That was, like I said, just really unprecedented before. So on the one hand, I often look at these tech companies and I feel like, wow, these are some incredible prices to be paying. But then on the other hand, you have to question, whether you're using the right metrics to evaluate what they're worth. And like I said before, the price to earnings ratio is manipulated. And especially if you're doing something like a price to book value, Google is going to look infinitely expensive on a price to book value. And you would have, not invested in it over the last 15 years. And you would have missed out on one of the best performing stocks of all time because of that. Because like what we talked about before, book value in a company's balance sheet does not necessarily do a good job, at least, how accounting standards exist today, capturing what a modern software-based company is worth.
Okay, well, we might leave it there. It's been great chatting with you, Shawn. Hopefully we can get you on the podcast again. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Phil. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope to be back on soon.
Thanks for listening to Stocks for Beginners. If you enjoy listening, please take a moment to rate or review in your podcast player, or tell a friend who might want to learn more about investing for their future.
Did you know that personal information, like addresses and phone numbers, is collected and sold by data brokers across the internet? Fortunately, Aura steps in, scanning the web, sending you alerts, and requesting the removal of your info when found. Get a 14-day free trial of Aura's full toolkit, including ID theft protection, parental controls, and more at aura.com/safety. That's AURA.com/safety.